Greetings everyone, and welcome to the weekly Facebook Bible study, week 14. Last week we concluded Joshua by talking about the division of the land and serving the Lord in the land. We also concluded Romans by talking about God's righteousness to Israel and to the Gentiles, God's righteousness in everyday life, and the extension of God's righteousness through the Pauline mission. We also got a final summary of the gospel of the righteousness of God. This week, we're going to introduce Judges. We're going to talk about the main purpose of this book and the cycle Israel finds itself in. We're also going to be introducing 1 Corinthians. We're going to discuss the problems of the church in Corinth and discuss Paul's reaction. Let's go into the book of Judges. Now, the book's name comes from the types of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes of Israel were ruled by judges. The book of Judges is disturbing and violent. It tells a tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, bad leadership, and basically how they became no different from the Canaanites themselves. The story is meant to generate hope for the future. Now, the first two chapters set the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites like they were told to. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories within the Promised Land. While Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken, and a lot of Canaanites were still living in those areas. Chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups that Israel failed to drive out from the land. The whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid the influence of their moral corruption and worship of their gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be holy people, but that did not happen. Now, chapter 2 describes how Israel simply moved alongside the Canaanites and began to adopt all their cultural and religious practices. Chapter 2 also delves into the part of Israel's history where they enter into a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. Now, this cycle proves the literary design and the flow of the next section in the book and is repeated for each of the 6 main judges. Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah are the first 3 judges, and their stories are classified as epic adventures which are very bloody. Either it is the judges themselves or the people helping them defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer and they focus on the character flaws, which only get worse. Chapters 6 through 9 focuses on Gideon. Now, Gideon starts out well. He's a coward of a man, but eventually comes to trust God and trust that God can save Israel through him. He defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying nothing but torches and clay pots. However, Gideon has a temper and murders several of his fellow Israelites for not helping him in battle. To make matters worse, he also makes an idol from gold he won in a battle, and after he dies, all of Israel worships it as a god, and the cycle begins once again. The next main judge is Jephthah, which is chapters 10 through 12. Now, this man is something who's rather looking like a mafia thug living on the hills. When things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his leadership. Now, he actually proves to be a very effective leader as he wins lots of battles against the Ammonites. But in the end, he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel that he treated God like a Canaanite deity and vowed to sacrifice his daughter if he won the battle. This tragic story shows just how far Israel has fallen, to the point where they no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and false worship. Now let's move on to 1 Corinthians. This letter was written to a church community that Paul knew very well. Corinth was a major port city in the ancient world with several temples, making it a huge economic religious center in the Roman world. Paul strategically traveled there as a missionary, spending about a year and a half getting to know the people and telling them about Jesus. Many people there became followers and eventually formed the first church community in the city. After a while, Paul left to start churches in other cities, but it wasn't long before he received a report that things were not going well in the Church of Corinth. They were being plagued by all kinds of problems, so Paul wrote this letter to offer guidance, teaching, and encouragement. Now, this book is broken up into 5 main parts and a final greeting. The 5 sections correspond to the 5 problems Paul addresses, so the letter reads like a collection of short essays. In each section, Paul defines a problem and responds to it with some part of the gospel, illustrating how these church members were not actually acting or living out what they said they believed. This pattern of problem, then the gospel solution, shows us how Paul is teaching the Corinthians to think as Christians. Following Jesus means developing the skills of seeing all areas of life and relationships through the lens of the gospel. In chapters 1 through 4, Paul defines the problem of divisions in the church. Some other Christian teachers had come through Corinth after Paul, like Apollo and Peter. The problem was that many Corinthians had picked favorites between the 3, and people became almost like groupies around these teachers. They would insult and disrespect those who didn't belong to their group. And Paul responds sharply by saying that the church is supposed to be a community of people centered around Jesus. Its leaders and teachers are simply servants of Jesus. While they may prefer one over the other, it's not worth something dividing over. The foundation of the community is not its leaders, but Jesus and the good news about who he is and what he's done. In chapters 5 through 7, Paul addresses the problems related to sex. There were a number of people who were sleeping around in the church, including a guy living with his stepmother. A number of these members were also still worshiping at the local temples to Greek gods and sleeping with the prostitutes there. Even more disturbing to Paul is the fact that many in the church were saying that this was all acceptable, by saying that they are free in Christ and that God's grace is bottomless. With the gospel in hand, Paul showed just how wrong-headed this thinking is. He calls them to remember that Jesus died for the consequences of their sins, which includes the ruined, broken relationships caused by sexual misconduct. If someone is Christian, their sexual integrity and purity is one of the main non-negotiable ways to respond to Jesus' love and grace. Paul also reminds them that just as Jesus was physically raised from the dead, our bodies will be too. Meaning that if your body is being redeemed by Jesus both now and in the future, then what you do with your body matters a lot. A Christian's body is not their own to do with whatever they want to. It belongs to Jesus and will be raised alongside him, and the body is meant to service him. Paul is very clear about the fact that being a follower of Jesus involves no compromise when it comes to sexual integrity. That concludes both our first parts of Judges and 1 Corinthians. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, we ask that you post them so that we can grow together in Christ. Thank you.